So I'd like to talk just a little bit about writing your manuscript. Writing is a fraught process. I've had students that have repeated their statistical analysis half a dozen times rather than starting to write their paper. Can you imagine someone who likes doing a statistical analysis more than writing? I think it's just that writing is something that we often don't want to sit down and do. But it's an essential part of the process. What I'd like to talk to you about is the structure of your manuscript, the types of manuscripts that you might write, and the essential components of those manuscripts, and a few errors that people make along the way, and places that you might look for help. You need to think, first of all, about what you want to say. Do you want to report the conclusion of a research project, perhaps, or summarize a number of previous research reports? Maybe you want to describe a particularly interesting or complex patient and the treatment you provided. Not a researcher, but a clinician contributing to the literature. You might want to describe a new technique that you're using in your clinic for fabrication. And you might want to disagree with something that somebody else has published. So what kind of publications suit these objectives of publication? Well, what do editors look for in the manuscript that you submit? Editors are looking for articles that present new evidence. They don't want to go over old stuff. If you might be presenting new evidence, and you might be presenting old evidence, but presenting it in a new way, or analyzing things in a new way that give different insights into data. You might want to question the established thinking because you've got a better theory about how we can approach a particular concept. You might just want to offer new ways of thinking. But what's really important is considering what will be of interest to the readership of a journal. And often the decision that an editor makes is, do my readers want to look at this? Is this within the scope of our journal, the reasons that attract people to read it? So what type of paper might we write? We might write an original, and these are types of papers that we consider in Prosthetics and Orthotics International. An original research report, a literature review, or a special type of literature review called a systematic review, case studies or case series, technical notes, clinical notes, or letters to the editor. Literature reviews are critical syntheses of orthotics, prosthetics, or related topics. Sometimes they're systematic in that they have a carefully described way of searching the literature, a way of assessing the quality of the papers that are included, a way of analyzing data reported by different researchers and combining that data using a meta-analysis of some sort. An original research report is a new clinical or experimental finding that advances clinical and theoretical fields in prosthetics and orthotics. A technical note is a paper that describes a new device or a method or a research instrument. A clinical note is a clinical research-based commentary that's preferably on a current issue. And a case study or a case series is based on an unusual presentation or a patient history that can contribute to the clinical or scientific literature. Often people think a case study is a good way of getting an experiment where you only have one subject published. So you do an experiment and you test two types of prosthetic feet, and you find in your one subject that they like one rather than the other, and you try to publish that as a case study. That's not a case study. It's an experiment that's underpowered to draw conclusions. So I know that there have been experiments with a single subject that have been published in Prosthetics and Orthotics International in the past. We no longer consider them. Journals have different requirements, formatting requirements for different types of papers. And I'd like to describe these to you for a couple of the types of papers that we consider. The formatting requirements relate to the format and the presentation and structure of the manuscript, to the figures and tables and captions in the manuscript, to the word length, the number of words that the manuscript can have, and the style of referencing that you need to use. And these things all change from journal to journal, and they change within journals for different types of publications. What you need to do is access journal information, read the requirements, and follow the directions, because a lot of editors get fed up with people who don't read directions, who don't access the information, and submit manuscripts that are unacceptable in terms of the journal guidelines. A research report is a very common type of publication, and most of the articles in Prosthetics and Orthotics International fall into this category. And just to give you an example of the requirements for this type of manuscript, we expect an abstract of 200 words, and that's a structured abstract. It has to have particular headings. It has to have a background. It has to have an aim statement. It has to have a research design statement, a method statement, and a conclusion statement. And we also require a clinical relevance statement of 50 words for an original research report. And the idea there is that we're trying to relate research back to clinicians. We're trying to make everything that we publish meaningful for the clinicians who are the biggest readership of Prosthetics and Orthotics International. So you write the abstract, you write the clinical relevance statement. The background, well, you write the abstract last, as Susan has said. The background is a general statement of the investigation. It's a review of the literature, what have other people done, and usually we write a background statement that starts very broadly with a statement of the general problem and then focuses down and down. It says, well, we know this big body of literature, but we have some questions about these particular aspects of the literature, and therefore the aim of this investigation is to do this. The background statement should conclude with a statement of the aims or hypotheses that you're investigating in this particular research project. Methods include the context and setting and the sample population that you study, including an ethics approval statement if this is a study on human subjects. It describes the apparatus, the methods, and the procedure, and it describes the statistical analysis. And it does it, the method section should describe those things in the order that I've listed them. Because scientists who read papers don't have a lot of time to go looking through an entire paper for a particular point that they want. We've evolved a style of writing in science that makes it easy for us to communicate with other scientists and easy for other scientists to read and understand our communication. So that when we go to a paper, if we're interested in the sample, we know that the population that was studied is going to be described right at the beginning of the methods section. And we know that the research design and analysis is going to be described at the end of the methods section. There's a structure that's accepted in scientific literature. After the methods, we have results section, where we organize and present the results around the hypotheses at the beginning of the paper. Okay, so the first and most important thing that you put in a results section is those particular statistical tests that answered the question that you were interested in asking in the first place. You should use tables and graphs to illustrate your key points and illustrate the data that you base your conclusions on. And it should state the results. It shouldn't discuss results. It should say, this is what we found. In the discussion, what you should do is state your conclusions. Start by saying, well, we started out asking this question, and this is what we found. This is the answer to the question. And this is how, so we either accept or reject our hypothesis, and we relate our findings to what other people have found. This is either the same as previous investigators, or it's different than previous investigators, or it explains something that was a conundrum because different people were getting different results. Relate your results to other researchers. State the limitations of your results. No one has ever done a perfect experiment. You have to acknowledge that your study has weaknesses. And even if you're very careful designing it at the beginning, you get to the end and you say, well, I wish I'd done that a little bit differently. It's important to acknowledge the weaknesses, and it's important to say how this takes you forward, where you're going to go with this, what the future directions are for this research. And then you state a conclusion. The conclusion should say, we concluded that. It shouldn't say, in future we want to do this experiment, or we're sorry that we didn't do this or that or the other thing. The conclusion is the conclusion. If you've got limitations and you've got future directions and you've got interpretations, put them back in the discussion. The conclusion should state what you found out. The main document should be 3,000 words for an original research report in Prosthetics and Orthotics International. Other journals have different requirements, but don't go over 3,000 words if you want to contribute an original research report to our journal. That 3,000 words excludes the abstract, the clinical relevance statement, the references, the captions. It's just the words. We have a limit of 5 figures and 3 tables maximum. So please don't exclude that. We've got limitations on the amount of space we have in the journal, and because of those limitations, we ask you to abide by the word limitations and the figure and table limitations. A case study or a case series has a different structure. It has an abstract of 150 words and a clinical relevance statement of 35 words. It has a background statement, but it's a short background statement. There's a description and methods section that describes the case, describes the treatment, describes how the outcomes were measured, and maybe says something about the patient gave consent to publish this. Usually in a case study, you don't plan a case study, and so you can't go off and get ethics approval for it. Someone presents at your clinic and you treat them in a particular way. You don't need to go to some review body to get approval to do that, but you do need to get patient permission to publish their personal information. So ethics approval processes differ between the type of research that you're doing. A case study has findings and outcomes that talk about the effectiveness of the treatments and the outcomes that were observed, and it has a discussion and conclusion. Some references, acknowledgements. The main document is a maximum of 2,000 words, and we have a limit of 3 figures and 2 tables. So there are differences between, in the format requirements between different types of article. So that's the structure of the article. What about how you go about writing it? What you need to do is write to a target audience. Use the third person, but that's a stylistic thing that is changing in the literature. Rather than saying the patient was assessed, often the style is changing to something like we assessed the patient. So a third person plural, a first person approach rather than a third person approach. Use the past tense to describe what others have done and what you did, because that's in the past. Use the present tense to describe the results that you're presenting. Data is presented in Figure 1. Data is presented in Table 3 because it's there. It's there in the present tense. Use spelling and grammar checkers and word processing applications. Don't submit a Word manuscript that has all sorts of those little red lines and little green lines all the way through it. Those little red lines and little green lines mean something. They mean you've spelled something wrong or you've used poor grammar. There's no excuse for submitting a paper that's not up to a good standard. Avoid jargon, anecdotes, stories, and avoid exceeding the limit. Just present the facts. Be objective. State concisely what others have done. State clearly what you did. Draw conclusions that are based on your findings. Demonstrate how your results relate to earlier researchers and acknowledge the limitations. Avoid subjective or emotive statements and avoid conclusions or recommendations that aren't supported by your data. Reviewers and editors go crazy when people draw conclusions that are not based in the data that they present. Figures and tables. Well, include figures and tables that enhance your presentation. Use high-resolution images. Graphs should simplify complex information. They shouldn't make it more complex and difficult to understand. Include detailed captions. Consider color. If you have a graph that has 3 or 4 different colors on it, and we print that in a black and white publication, all of a sudden you can't distinguish one line for another. Think about how you use color and how that color will present in a grayscale or black and white publication. Tables should present summary data. Avoid data for individuals. Don't put data for each individual in your paper. Present summary data. Avoid data overload. Don't put in a table that takes up a whole page of numbers. It's incomprehensible and it doesn't enhance your presentation. Don't duplicate data and figures don't duplicate data in your figures and your tables. Don't do a bar graph that replicates means and standard deviations in an adjacent table. When you've got your manuscript ready, create a title page that has your authors and your correspondence address and upload it to the system. Keep that title page separate from the main document that has all of the text in it. Because of our double-blind review process, we don't want identifying information in the main text. We don't want reviewers to try to figure out who you are because your patients were all recruited from a particular hospital. Submit your figures and tables separately. You can also submit appendices and supplementary material. Redact any identifying information except from the title page so that your final document doesn't have information in it that will identify you. Some common, some common reasons for rejection now. It's outside the aims and scope. We don't accept papers on joint replacement prostheses. We don't accept papers on surgery that's not relevant to to a prosthetic fitting and rehabilitation outcome. Read the aims and scope of the journal that you're submitting to and understand the kind of papers that they're recruiting. Sometimes a topic is too broad or information is available at the textbook level. We're not interested in replicating what's already out there in undergraduate textbooks. If it doesn't add to the existing literature, and you as an author have to explain to the editor and the readers how your manuscript contributes, how it contributes and enhances the body of knowledge. Poor presentation, poor grammar and spelling, poor structure, failure to comply with author guidelines will often result in you getting it straight back. Flawed methods or analysis, doing inappropriate statistics is another reason for rejection, and drawing conclusions that aren't supported by the data. Finally, help is at hand. ISPO, for beginning researchers, new researchers, ISPO has a program called Improving Prosthetic and Orthotic Science, IPOS. It's open to members of ISPO. What we do in that program is match mentors with mentees for the preparation of proposals, for designing research projects, for writing papers for publication. There's an application process, there's information on the website. There's also, for people who are concerned mostly about the presentation, the grammar and spelling, Sage Language Services offers a service that for a small fee allows you to submit a manuscript to an editor who will professionally edit it in preparation for submission.